So today we are down in Nashville, and in this hang, we're going to learn about Cory Wasnewsky's instrumental letterpress print series. The series features various instruments created by using existing wood type, metal type, dingbats, and cymbals. We've been lucky to show them here at Hamilton. In the New Impressions exhibition, they're beautiful and stunning in person, which is always fun to, it's always better to see a print in person. Cory is a printer, designer, and press mechanic at Hatch Show Print. On the clock, he enjoys learning the traditional ways of letterpress trade so he can bend the rules and push the boundaries of letterpress. In his spare time, he works under the press name 3 Cheers Press, where he does job printing, designing, and press repair house calls. I don't know how much spare time you have, Cory, but I'm really glad that you agreed to do this ham hang. So thank you. I'm so glad that you're going to share with us.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for having me. Excited to see everybody, especially some folks that I see usually, but now I can see you without masks. Yeah, I mean, I figured just get right into it, and then that way we can have time for questions and hanging out after. So I'll share my screen, and you'll see that I'm not technologically adept. So this first slide, what it is, I call this series instrumental. It kind of was a working title at the start, but it seems to fit the more and more that it goes on. Like Stephanie said, I work at Hatch Show Print 9 to 5 on the clock. It's also where I make all of these instruments. You can see the shot on the left of that. I print a lot on our Universal 3, but one thing I do want to point out is I'm not using any of Hatch's type or photo plates or dingbats or anything. This is all for my personal collection. And I'll talk about the difference that you can kind of see from the start of this project to the current state. And you can see the collection has grown, and it's allowed me to do more with the instruments. When it started, speaking of that, I started doing this in 2013, started making instruments. For those of you who haven't talked to me a lot, I started at Hatch in the fall of 2014, which was about 4 or 5 months after I graduated with my BFA. It's the only post-college job that I've had. So really those first couple of years was really learning the ins and outs of letterpress, doing production work at Hatch just like I do now, learning all these new things and trying to push the boundaries and understand the limits of the type, the presses, the paper, the ink, and I guess the design world. So the first 4 instruments I made, these are the first 4 that I made in 2017. I chose these 4 because I live in Nashville. It's nicknamed as Music City. Every year at Hatch, we used to have an exhibit that was called Moonlighting. And it was a display of all the work that the designer and printers at Hatch would make off the clock. And we would be on exhibit in the Haley Gallery, showing what we did. And I thought it was just a kind of a nice nod to the city. These are typical bluegrass, country, Western swing instruments. And I thought it was just a good place to start. You can see at the start, I was doing a lot of colors, and you'll see as I go on, it gets a lot more sloppy at the beginning, but finer tuned at the end when the print is actually made. So I was spending a lot of time figuring out colors, really focusing on trying to make this initial sketch, which I would make in Procreate on my iPad, look like what I wanted the final print to look like. And that way I thought it would be easier to go through the whole process and be able to match, piece by piece exactly what I wanted. And this is why I would want to point out, because I was using my own collection, I didn't have a lot of the dingbats and everything. I was kind of limited to some type that I had gotten for free in really bad condition and tried to clean up, some type that I had purchased. And then I had purchased some of the monoblocks from Skyline Type Foundry. You can see that on the dobro. Kind of my use of those, but there wasn't a lot of various sizes of type, so I was limited in what I could actually do. And for those first, I'd say for those first four at least, and then even going on further from that a little bit, I would print out those initial sketches at full size and typeset directly on them, but then I would use a print to try to register everything exactly where I needed it when I typeset, because I didn't want to waste a lot of make ready. So that's what you can see on the left would be the finished fiddle, but on the right was actually me tracing the back of an actual print. So I print the first layer, trace it so I could get that second layer on, and trace it again so I could get that third layer exactly where I wanted it. And part of that was because I was really trying to limit, make some rules for myself of I wanted these instruments to be no more than 3 layers or 3 colors at the start. And that allowed me to really think, what does each instrument really need to be viewed as that instrument? What makes a fiddle be recognizable as a fiddle? You know, if we took the F holes out of the fiddle, it could be a fiddle, it could be who knows what else. So that was part of it, and understanding the registration issues. And I was working through a lot of those process problems to make it as streamlined as possible, but not really production friendly. Not that I guess it really needs to be, but that's how my brain works, is how production friendly can I make it. So the first instrument that I actually did was the acoustic guitar. And so this is just a shot. You can see I would print out 3 and try to lay them all out at the same time. And that was one way that I figured out that it actually made it easier for me to register and waste less prints if I typeset all 3 layers at the same time. But for those first 4 instruments, like I said, I had a limited amount of type and blocks and all that, so I wasn't able to always do that. This is, I think, one of the first few instruments where I was able to, because one of those layers, as you can see on the far right, it's a lot of little pieces, and then the middle first layer is a lot of the big type, and then kind of in the middle. But being able to do that versus printing a layer, then having to use the same blocks on another layer, it allowed it to go a little quicker, but not really so fast that it made sense to do one versus the other quite yet. So this is another, you can see there's 2 different layers. This was another one where I was able to typeset a couple layers at the same time. But even in those first 4 instruments, I was starting to do some unique things that, you know, when I'm only printing 20 or 25 instruments or prints, I'm not trying to make them all exactly the same. I'm not making an edition of 100 or 200 or 300 or 1,000. It was, I could spend some time on each layer. So I was hand brayering them at the start. And using what would have been a split fountain on the brayer to get that sunburst effect. And I thought that was something that I think it helped the viewer understand that it was a specific model of guitar. I think some guitars or dobros or instruments or whatever, the colorway I think is as important as the shape and all that. And I would argue that a lot of guitar makers and instrument makers would agree. There's certain models that they only make in certain colors or in certain colorways, or they make them in a certain material that they don't make their other models in. So I was doing a lot of research at the same time of what made this instrument important. So when I did that, the gradient that you see, the sunburst, I was hand braying and then just going in a circle to try to keep the burst each one is a little different when you actually looked at all the prints together, but they all had a sunburst effect. And then that middle print you can see is a heavy use of those monoblocks from Skyline. I think I have started to wear down because I've used them so much. And then the final print on the right. And this is just a detailed shot of that dobro close up. I think this might have been the first instrument that was shown at Hamilton. I think one of the new impressions, this instrument went up there, was selected. But you can see those monoblocks, the squares and diamonds, and but this was all, it's all typeset. It was all, there's furniture in between of all of it and everywhere. I wasn't really getting too crazy with what you'll see to come, especially some of you probably will know the bagpipe. I think it's one of the most well-known instruments that I've done so far, but I use other materials to help typeset. But this was all with furniture and metal and wood spacing and everything. But I was also using, you can see the foam for the circle, the banjo, so that would have been the black layer. So I was using other materials, but it's not something that I knew I couldn't do with furniture. And that was kind of, it's not a rule that I really abide by, because I think if you talk to anybody that I've worked with, I'm not too concerned about what it looks like on press as long as it looks good on the piece of paper. You know, I probably make some of the ugliest lockups that those traditional folks would scoff at, like this one, but it worked. It allowed me to get that circle shape, and it allowed me to do it in a way that was safe for the type and safe for the press, and it got me the result I wanted. What I kind of am upset that I did is I taped the letters to the outside of that foam, and probably what I would do if I was making this banjo in 2021 is just cut slots to drop those letters in, as opposed to taping them. It seems to just hold it better when you taped it. When I taped it, I don't know if how many people have experienced it, but when you have tape on blocks and you're running a lot of them, the tape tends to make a lot of workups. But when you're taping the physical blocks like this, the letters were actually coming up, and then they would get stuck like on an angle, and they wouldn't print completely flat. You can kind of see it. One is on an angle. If you look on the bottom right of the banjo, you can see how one's kind of like a half of an eye. That's also that type from India. I don't know if anybody has some of that. I think every letterpress printer who buys type has one set of that, and it's trash, but we all have them because they're all really beautiful, like unique faces. But that was part of what my collection was, is the Indian type was affordable and available to me. So I made it work as best as I could. So then I continued adding to my collection. You can see on the left, I had gone to one of the type sales at Paul Akin's and purchased a bunch of dingbats and symbols and arrows and things like that, and some stuff that I bought from Scott, and just getting more type from folks who were selling it, you know, around the country. Or there's some folks in Nashville that would reach out and say they had some stuff and make a trade or go get it for free or buy it or whatever. But that around the same time as all that was happening, I had finished those first four, and I didn't really think of this as a series that I was going to do for as long as I ended up doing it. But I was having I'd had a lot of fun making those first four. So I said, you know, what the hell, I'll make some more. And I decided to do 10 different guitars. And so you can see that on the right. But my collection wasn't quite big enough to typeset all 3 layers at the same time. Or I would say not varied enough to do all 3 layers at the same time. But it was big enough to do multiple guitars at the same time. So the way I approached the guitars was to typeset all the first layers, print all the first layers of all 10, then do the second layers, and then do the third layers. And that was kind of looking back on it, it's kind of a weird way to do it, because then you're thinking about all these different models and what they all have to look like. And I would have rather just done one guitar at a time. But you live and learn doing that. And so this is just 3 of the 10. It was a Les Paul Gold Top, an L5, and a Flying V. These were 3 that were shown in one of those moonlighting exhibits. But I chose the 10 different models that I thought and that I felt were kind of important in terms of either folks who played them and what those people did for music, the history of music, or what those, the historical value of those guitars, or just they were different enough from one of the other models. So they are specific. It was a 59 Les Paul Gold Top, and then it was the L5 that was based off of Mother Maybelle. And then I did the Flying V just because I'm a big fan of the sounds that guitar makes. But there were other ones I did. I did a double neck. I did the SG. So all those guitars that even the folks I think who aren't guitar nerds, they would recognize these guitars because the folks who play them, I'm sure they listen to those bands, and I'm sure they could go, oh, that's, so-and-so plays that guitar in that band. And so that's really what those first 10 were all selected about. I've had thoughts in my head and if I want to do more, but I think it kind of starts getting redundant because it's just the same model made by a different company, and there's like a slight tweak, which is noticeable when you see it in person, but when you abstract those instruments down to wood type and these kind of hard edge squares and everything, they look pretty similar. And so I don't want to repeat too much and have it get stale when it comes to those guitars. So this is where you can see my initial sketch is kind of evolving and becoming a lot more loose. And I'm still thinking about like certain letters being used. You can see, again, using those monoblocks with a curve. I knew that was always going to be the case. But in the sketch, you can see the eyes in my head being used for the finger triggers, but not really focusing on, oh, there has to be, a little bump here, a little bump there. And I found that through all of that, and I'll go through a couple of slides while I'm talking, it made it easier to distance that final piece from the photo that I was using as reference, because I was literally tracing a photo that I found to get the sketch. But if I tried to get it dead on, it made the final piece be a little too close for me. It didn't allow me what I felt was enough freedom to just make decisions based off of like the pieces that I was using, the widths of the type, the height, all the different things that account for how we could typeset it. This was a good example too of there's pieces that are in the sketch that are missing from the final, but it had to be like that. Otherwise it wouldn't have, I guess, that organic feeling. But it all physically, some of them weren't possible, especially in this case of the French horn. But then some of them are very close in terms of exactly what it looks like. So I started to hone in on, this is what I wanted to do, is there was that one step of deviation from that initial photo to the sketch. And then once I got it in sketch form, I never looked at a photo again until I was doing a color reference. And that helped me. I think it helps make it more, these are type instruments. These aren't just recreations that, they could be carved, because that was something that I really wanted to make sure was these pieces, we can all carve blocks to make it look exactly how we want, but these are made from ready-made materials of type and ornaments and symbols and blocks and all that. Um, this is so the bagpipe is one of the ones that I think it was one of the first times where I broke that rule that it can only have 3 layers on it. As you can see, there's 4 different colors in the sketch. And then there's actually, I think, about 6 passes through the press to get the final print. But I think it was one of the first times where I was sick of just making the guitar after guitar after guitar. So this is one of the first wind instruments, which was after I did those 10 guitars, was the next section of instruments I wanted to work on. And I wanted to have a lot of fun with it because I know the history behind bagpipes. A lot of it has to do with what is that pattern, that was the clan, that was the family. Do I want to do one that's like historically accurate? Do I want to make my own kind of thing? And this was made in 2018, I believe. Might have been 2019. And so, I had a few years under my belt at Hatch. I was getting really comfortable breaking the rules of letterpress, whatever those are, whoever makes those up, and trying out all these crazy things just to get, I wanted that print to look exactly how I wanted. I almost wanted it to look like it was impossible to do it via letterpress. And a lot of these instruments, that's kind of the feeling, is I want people to look at them and not be able to go, oh, this is exactly how he did it. I want people to kind of look at him and question, like, how's he doing that? So one of the things that I did is, you can see it's the same print, but on one side it's all in that tan for the pipes, and on the other side there's some black. So that was one where I, printed the whole thing and then just overprinted to get the black. This is where I started using that gator board that you can see on the right. So I can typeset nuts, or daredevil typesetting as it's called. And it's all still tight. It's not going to break anything. But for pieces like the string and the ribbon, it's gator board or foam board. It's like I think it's like 3/4 inch that we get, where, for those who don't know, Hatch is connected to the Country Music Hall of Fame. So they use a lot of this stuff for their signage. And then they just throw it away. So we usually take it and can do stuff like this with it. But it holds really well. And then I had purchased some, the ribbon border from Skyline specifically for this, to get those tassels to look exactly the way they did. So many people ask me how I do it. This is exactly how the plaid is made, part A. So I typeset that one mass in blocks. You can see it on the press in the far left, printed it in red, and then cleaned off the blocks. And then you'll see it in the next slide. But I carved a brayer to be that plaid. And without moving any guides or anything in the press, ran it through again, but inked up the block with that plaid brayer. And that way it registered exactly where it needed to get that piece. And then it went through one more time. I had a skinny brayer that I used white, that you can see little white lines in the plaid as well. So as you can see, there's 3 layers here just for this one section of the bagpipe. So I broke my rule of having only 3 layers, but it was something that I think it needed to have this to really push those boundaries. And this was one of the things that everybody always asked me how I did it. Immediately, I think it blew their minds to see something like this. So that brayer for the plaid is on the left. And then if you have been following along on my Instagram, the brayer on the right is I carved again to make some tiger stripes. And you'll see a detail shot of the brayering on the next one. But even so, these 2 brayers were, I think, the first example of like making my own materials, I guess. But this isn't something that doesn't exist. I mean, they make wallpaper brayers in a way. They're just not hard rubber. They make foam ones that you can use with paint. So it's not a new invention. I wouldn't even say I'm reinventing the wheel. I was just making it out of something that I knew worked for printmaking, which is rubber brayers. I carved them with a razor and a Dremel that had I think it was a metal cutoff wheel on it to make the cuts. That was what I used at a pretty high RPM, if anybody is interested, because it actually is a combination of cutting and melting. And it smells and the little particles go everywhere, but it goes really smoothly using those metal cutoff wheels. And between these two brayers, one thing that I did want to note is the pattern. The plaid brayer actually has a natural starting point, so to speak, because there's a heavy side where there's more brayer still left. So I was able to register in the same exact spot every time. With the tiger stripes, there's not a natural bottom spot. So I had to make it so the side to side kind of was ambiguous of exactly where it lined up. And so you can see that on the block here. It took four widths of the brayer was what I brayered, but I brayered from in the photo what would be left to right to get those. And it was the same thing if I printed all these blocks and then registered it just like the bagpipe, but used this. So between each one of printing the tiger stripes, I actually had to wipe off the block with a clean rag to make sure that I didn't have like ghosting prints or shadow prints or anything like that, and to make sure it was pretty clean. I eventually started just inking it super heavy and could get 2 prints in a row out of it. And that was my way of, instead of spending an hour printing it, I could spend like a half hour printing this one layer. And so that's something that I think I always kind of do that when I'm on press, is how can I do this at the same quality but faster. And I think that's partly just how my brain works as a production printer, even for what I would call art pieces, as these instrumental prints are. So this is getting back, like I'm still using the foam core, though this is the French horn that you saw. It looks like a mess in the foam on that first layer. Typically what I do is I just put the blocks in on top of that printout and then just shove in furniture until everything's tight and I can lift up the board and just walk with it like you walking it into a chase. There's nothing fancy about it. I just shove everything in until it's tight. And the gator board has a little bit of give, so it's actually, it kind of acts like a coin, or if anybody has ever used those galley springs where you can close them but then they open. So it kind of works like that, maybe not to the same extent, but it has just enough give that you can you get to a point where you shove in one more piece of like 2-point wetting and then it's tight and then you can pick everything up. But at the same time, for this one, I had purchased some of the scrap from Jerry at Virgin, her scrap cuts, it's a great deal, and I'm using some of them to CNC like circles and stars and different dingbats and things on my own, but some of them are really thin, so I cut them down into 10 pica by 2 pica blocks, which if I had told myself that when I was starting, I would say, oh, that's cheating because it's not something that's ready-made, but it is, and there's eyes that I'm sure are 2 picas wide exactly. So I'm going to consider it not cheating. But setting it again with all that mono blocks and getting all the curves for that second layer of that French horn. So then this is one that I did recently. It was a cigar box guitar, and I had bought this really beautiful photo print of what I thought was Lewis and Clark, but I'm pretty sure it's Washington on the river. And I got it from Paul Aiken at that same type sale. But I thought it was just a really beautiful halftone plate, but it only printed in one color. And when you look at beautiful images of cigar boxes and the labels, and it's kind of like looking at old can labels, everything's really colorful and beautifully ornate and all the design and everything. So I thought Well, it should have color, but I don't want to sit here and pressure print and carve and all that. So I just watercolored. I think it was 25 prints that I had. So they're all different. They're all essentially one-offs, but they all are the same guitar box. They're all the same print. Um, and again, just continuing to add to my personal collection. I had purchased uh, a cabinet of type from a friend who had a shop a few years ago that they closed down, and he had this beautiful type for that Going West cigars typeface and the script and everything, which I thought worked really well. Um, and so continuing to do things kind of outside the norm, I would say, is this is actually a close-up of a ukulele. And I really wanted to have kind of the wood plank effect to it. So all I did was I took out the crescent and the oscillating roller um, on that Universal 3, just removing that crescent so it makes it so the oscillator doesn't go back and forth. Some of you might know that I have casted worm gear so that the oscillators move less and less. It moves about 2/3 as much as usual. But for this one, I really wanted those lines to be visible so that it looked like a plank of wood or planks of wood put together. And some of them, you can really see like some orange stripes in there and all that. But what I did to make it blend a little bit is I do move the oscillating roller with a screwdriver, like very slightly, but all the presses at Hatch, for whatever reason, and they're all level according to calibrations and levels and everything, but all the oscillating rollers drift to the non-operator side. And I don't know what it is. I think they're just trying to get away from us. But so I had to let it run and then push it back a little bit, and then it would naturally go that way and get just a little bit of blend. And so this is just it's a detailed shot of the Elb horn, but it's highlighting that I started to break having all the blocks be at the same angle, so to speak. So there's starting to change instead of up and down, they're at 45s and everything, but not using the foam board. So it's not all different angles, it's just very specific angles. And so those can be really seen really well in the saxophone up by the mouthpiece and this Elb horn. And it was one of those instances where when I was making it, I was trying to figure out if I could do it without changing the angle, because I would rather prefer to set everything at the same baseline, because that's how we do it. That's how we all do it. And it's so much easier that way. But the blocks don't, it can get very choppy and very Lego looking, which is fine for some people, and it might have been fine, but it wasn't something that I really was super into. And so then I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough. This is how I make the instruments from start to finish. And this is actually the first instrument where I used strings. If any of you have noticed that none of the instruments have printed strings before. So this is the printout. I had already made the sketch. I printed out in reverse so that it prints the direction I want. I skipped a slide. Wait. Hold on. All right. So then I'm typesetting, pulling the blocks, just sitting them right on top of where I want, putting all the furniture in. This is it inked up on press. This is actually silver, metallic silver. It's really hard to get photos of, and the lights at Hatch are really hard to take photos under because they're all over the place and really high up and really warm lighting. But it was printed in metallic silver, so there's the first layer inked up on press. There it is printed. You can see it's not a very in-depth technique that I'm using. So pretty much anybody could do this. So if you want to, definitely do it. The second layer, I used the foam core. You can see it over here. It was actually I think it's a darker silver. It looks really black in these photos, but it was just silver with a little black mixed in. Again, using some of those dingbats that I got from Paul or from Skyline. In that case that I purchased for my friend, he had a drawer full of hundreds of those 1 and 2 point brass rules. And so I cut out the shape of the strings that I wanted, and then each one is a half a pica distance from the next one. I don't know if this is the exact number of strings on a harp, but it looks beautiful close up. So this is just a couple detail shots at the top and bottom. And then printed. And so this, and there's a few more that I'll be making in the future where I have strings, but this is one of those instruments that if I didn't print the strings, it wouldn't look like a harp. So I knew I had to do that. And it feels really cool to like run your finger over, except for it ruined the packing just because it's all metal rule. And I don't know, I mean, our packing's kind of beat all the time anyways. But some of the rules were, you know, they had worked up a little bit, but you can't tell, or they're like bent. So you can see there's some like deviations in it, which I thought, I mean, I'm okay with those things. And that's something that I think printer to printer, some folks are more okay with these kind of things. I'm a little bit more loose with how I want the final print to look like. I'm more concerned with the overall image as opposed to these little tiny details. So this is, and I'm hoping nobody's looking on a TV so you can't see all the tiny details. This is all the instruments that are completed so far, scanned in, you know, color corrected, a lot of guitars, a lot of world instruments. I think that's something that I really wanted to make sure. I want the history of all these instruments. I want that, but I also don't want to do just instruments that are in mainstream American music, because that's kind of exclusive, and I don't think that that's the correct way to go about all of this. But this is just the spread of everything that's been done so far. So some of you have been following me on Instagram. There's some that you probably haven't seen before, and then there's some where you've seen little detail shots but not the whole thing. And that all leads me to, some of you know that I'm trying to put together a book. I'm hoping by the end of the year, but I'm having a lot of decisions between what I want to include in the book. Is it just the instruments? Do I want to put the history of the instruments? Do I want to have writings and photos of musicians? So I've spent a lot of time doing that. A lot of quarantine I spent doing layouts and thinking about the book and doing some writing and research on printing or approaching publishers and all of that. And then recently I would say a couple months ago, I decided, well, I'll make a list of all the instruments that I want to include. And until I'm done printing those and laying out the book, that I'm not going to make any of those decisions. Because I figure that it's too much to kind of think in my head of what's this book going to look like before I'm even done making the content. It'd be like trying to figure out what the cover of a novel is going to be before you finish writing the novel. But for those of you who want to keep following along and know when the book is pre-ordered or available, you can either follow me on my website, which isn't as updated as often, but it's just threecheerspress.com. Instagram would be your best bet as following along to see the progress on it. You're not going to see every instrument before it's in the book, because then there wouldn't be a reason for you to buy the book. But you can follow me at threecheerspress on Instagram, or if you want to just say hey, you can just email me at threecheerspress@gmail. So thanks for listening, and I'll try to stop my screen share.
Sweet. And I'm going to remove your spotlight just so we can see everybody for a bit. That was great. Everybody was peeking at your seeing what ones they hadn't seen yet, which is cool. In fact, somebody said, did I see a didgeridoo?
Yes, you did. That was a really fun one to make.
That was absolutely stunning, Cory. I follow along on Instagram, but being able to actually see the process is awesome. I just had a couple questions in the chat, and then if people want to unmute and just ask questions, that's fine. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can always raise your hand. Some people feel more comfortable being called on. Either way works for me. The couple of questions that were in the chat already is Hans was asking a little more about the brayering. He said, did he have to apply the brayer more than once? I'm wondering about holding registration on the pattern he's applying.
Oh yeah, so for the plaid one, like I mentioned, that brayer had a natural heavy spot, so it always started in the same spot. So there's a slight, and if you look at the prints very closely, there is a slight deviation of plaid to plaid, but it works for that pattern slash fabric look, in my opinion, and I think that's again something that's person to person. Where it's supposed to be a fabric, so it can have a little bit of a shadow effect, but because I had that natural heavy spot, I could always start it in the same spot and pretty much hit the same thing every time. And then I mentioned with the tiger stripe one, I actually had to wipe it with a dry cloth just to make sure that it didn't have those shadow effects, because I couldn't guarantee I was starting it in the same spot every time. And that was one thing I did actually try to think of how to make a natural heavy spot for that tiger stripe one, but there wasn't really a good way to do it.
Did you have a spot on the brayer that you kind of tried to hit every time when you started, like a mark on the edge or anything, or?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned that the tiger stripe was for the snare drum, and the snare drum was exactly 4 brayers wide. It just happened to be when I typeset it, so I could start at the bottom every time and go up and then move the brayer over and go again. But not, it just happened to be that it was that perfect width, but that's because there wasn't that natural heavy spot. I had to wipe it so that it didn't just kind of become black, essentially.
Yeah. And then the last really good question from the chat was, what instruments do you play? Which I think is a great question.
I have not played an instrument in about 5 or 6 years, probably since I moved to Nashville. I used to play bass guitar in a punk band back home in Massachusetts in college before moving down here, and I knew how to like really poorly play the gut bucket and things like that. But I don't actually play many instruments. I'm just very into music. I want to be good at it, but I would like to be, it's fun to kind of listen to different music and think of it more like not critiquing it, but listening to all the nuances of the different records and what musicians are doing on their albums, especially nowadays. I think there's so much crossover and experimentation and genres that I'm very into that side of music, which I think is why I'm drawn to doing all these instruments, not just, I play guitar, so I want to do 40 different guitars.
Nice. Well, those are my questions, my official questions from the chat. So if anybody has any more, this is a good time to chat and ask questions.
Cory, there is a long hatch tradition for using things like the body of a banjo or a guitar as the backdrop for the poster. And so I'm just curious if you find that is there a crossover from the standpoint that you get asked to make those things, maybe not so much in the constructions you have, but in general carving where you're creating things like that for posters?
I do build things out of type for posters. I have made like a robot it was like an Alton Brown live show that was called like Eat Your Science. I've made I think it was like I made like Cowboy and Cowgirl for like the Hatch retail store. So I don't think it's something. I've had one freelance client who I had made a bird like before doing instruments. I had made like a bird out of type, and she really liked it. And I had done a couple different things because she was trying to get a children's book published, so wanted to make a couple pages to go to publishers with about how she wanted the book illustrated. Nothing ever came of that, but that was the only instance where somebody saw what I was doing with making this imagery in this way and having it being asked to do that specifically for her. But otherwise, it's typically not so much at work at Hatch. That's more, this person, the imagery, I just feel like building it out of type. But I wouldn't say it's something that people typically ask for. And most of the time it's not production friendly, which is more the case of why we print weird things and carve things. It's more production friendly to do it that way than to spend a couple hours building something out of type that then might not even get approved as a design.
Thanks.
There are a couple questions in the chat. Where did you go to school and what did you major in?
I went to Montserrat College of Art. It's up in Beverly, Massachusetts. It's about a 25-minute train ride north of Boston. And my BFA, I have a concentration in book arts. So I studied letterpress and then fine bookbinding. So that's what my background's in. I used to do a lot of bookbinding, and then it got too tedious for me or something. I don't know, which is funny to say because we're all, letterpress printers. It's the same thing. I think I had to pick one thing to really put all my focus into. But that is what I went to school for.
Sweet. There was another question. I do really like this. What materials or things have you tried to print that didn't work at all?
Well, I don't know. Some of you will know. Heather and I did a workshop called "I Can Print That." I think it was at 2019's Ways Goose.
Mm-hmm.
Every material will print. It just depends on how many you want to make. Things that haven't worked though. I don't know if I would say materials that I've tried that haven't worked. I mean, there's things like bubble wrap will work. I've used it, but then it pops and things it doesn't come out the way you want. I do try to. I think there's been times where I tried to print paper, but do it in a pressure printing kind of way, and it just didn't. It's not so much that the technique isn't working; it's just not getting the result that I want. But part of the combination of working outside and in the shop, on the clock, is trying all these crazy things. And sometimes at Hatch, I'll make a design and then it'll get approved, and then I'll go, "Oh shit, how do I actually do that?" So it's a lot of backpedaling, but then I know how to do it for the next time, and then we'll have an example for a client kind of thing. So yeah, I want to say there's materials that don't work, but it might not be the result that you're looking for.
That's nice. Richard Zaid, I saw you have a question, but you're unmuted. Do you want to ask it?
I'm unmuted. Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, just go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I was just wondering if you've ever thought about doing any kind of tribute guitars, like B.B. King's Lucille or Willie Nelson's Trigger, Eddie Van Halen's Stripe Body, anything like that.
When I was doing the guitars, I had thought about that, but I wanted it to be more for those guitars. When I did the first 10, I wanted it to be more about the model of the guitar. And I know those are very, like you're saying, and we can all think of exactly what Eddie Van Halen's striped guitar looks like. We can all think of what B.B. King's Lucille looks like. And so the colorways on the guitars some of them are it was an ES 355, and it's a very specific green that was the Chris Cornell model, because it was when I was working on those, I believe it was a couple months after he passed away. And I grew up listening to Chris Cornell and Soundgarden and all that from my parents. So it's not specific models to those people, but it was just more about the model, and it just the colors were kind of a nod, like the Jaguars, a nod to the colorway that Kurt Cobain played, kind of thing. It was nothing to tie it directly. I didn't want it to become this is Eddie Van Halen's striped guitar, you know, if I had made that. It was a thought though, of do I want to do that or do I want to make it about the model?
Right. Cool.
One person also just asked, how big are they?
All the prints are 18 by 24.
Nice.
The paper size, yeah. So you might have noticed the ukulele is actually, it's printed on 18 by 24, but it's much smaller of the actual like printing area.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all meant to be sort of in ratio.
Nice. There's a couple little notes over there, but if you guys want to unmute and ask, please feel free. We're all chatting about your licorice that you printed with
Oh, yeah.
Heather.
And there was, I think Lindsay printed toaster bread.
Cory,
And Trader Joe cookies.
That's right.
Say the cookies were good, but they didn't taste very good after you printed them. So you should have told me.
Well, that's just your opinion. Some of us like that extra flavor.
Yeah,
Hey,
that's not
Cory.
enough.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hey, Cory, it's Jim.
Oh man.
You know, I know you pretty well. You could have printed motorcycles. You could have printed tattoos, anything. But so I'm asking for everybody who isn't as familiar with you and your work years at Hatch. We live in a city called Music City. We work in the same building as the Country Music Hall of Fame. There's music instruments everywhere. Yes, Moran is correct in saying music instruments always embellish the Hatch posters historically and still do. But there was something, what was your launch moment when you thought, I bet I can make these specifically out of furniture and wood type and give them their own identity? And I don't think it's as simple as you saying, well, you know, it's Nashville. There's got to be more to it. And I think everybody would like to know where A turned into L, which turned into Q, which turned into Z, where you're at right now. And thanks for your answer.
Yeah. Honestly, I think a lot of it was I grew as an artist. I feel like everybody, you know, you're doing what you do senior year of art school or wherever, and you kind of have that experience of, well, I don't really know. It's like sort of pressure of like what you want to do, what should you be doing. And so I was carving a lot that last year of school. I carved a lot pretty much that first year outside of school. That was what my art was a lot of carving. I did kind of get sick of carving for a little bit because I was also doing it on the clock. So I was carving on the clock, I was carving off the clock, I was typesetting posters. So I didn't really want to make more posters. I didn't want to do the same thing off the clock that it was on the clock. And I started getting, you know, I had made a couple things on the clock built out of type, just kind of messing around for the retail store where there's a little bit more freedom. And so then I think it just kind of turned into, you know, that's really fun if there's no pressure of deadlines or what it has to look like. I kind of naturally gravitated towards it, I would say.
You're your own client.
Yeah, and I mean that, and it just the instruments. I think it's a combination of my interest in just music in general, but also knowing, you know, like you said, where we live and what we're, you know, working downtown. You used to, when I would have to walk to the parking garage, there'd be somebody playing across the street, you know, every day, 7 days a week, pretty much from 10 a.m. until 7 a.m. So I was kind of surrounded by it, but it felt natural to do things, something like instruments they're organic, but we all know that we all know what they're supposed to look like. You know, we can all, if I say, oh, I wanted to do a tree, we all have a different vision of a tree in our minds, but we know what a trumpet looks like. Or like you said, this is something that like way back in my mind is, well, when I finish with this book, do I want to do a second volume? Do I want to do other things like cars or some, other things that you can't have different visions of what they are, so that when somebody's looking at it, they go, oh, that is a trumpet. But then it comes down to abstracting it down to what it is so that it's recognizable, but it can't vary like a tree. Like we can all think of a different tree again, so I think that's where it kind of came into, as part of it was I got sick of carving and my wrist, where my body was taking a toll from carving, and illustrating and all that. And it felt better to use these ready-made things to make something than make something brand new.
Thank you.
Cory, do you think part of this is kind of the way you're wired? And I say that because you are interested in the instruments and how they are put together, but you're also very mechanically minded. You do so much of the repair work. And so what I see is that you aren't just interested in a press, you're so interested in its construction and how it works together. And the instruments seem like a very nice method of constructing the thing as opposed to simply liking the sound.
Yeah, I think that's also part of why building it out of type and ready-made materials is appealing to me. Is I've started, and like starting out, I didn't know this, but like you're saying, learning the ins and outs of the press, I now understand that if the letter E block that I have is too narrow, that the letter H is just a little bit wider in the same font. And so I know all these little tricks to really quickly make changes and understanding how the print comes together. But yeah, I think it is the same thing with the instruments is, and that's why it's, I would say easy. I don't know if easy is the right term, but I'll say it, to abstract them down to their bare minimum of what it needs to be recognizable. What does the construction of that instrument need to be before it's not that instrument anymore? If I left off the bell of a trumpet, what would it be? It wouldn't be a trumpet. If I left off the F holes of an L5, what guitar would it be? So those are thinking of it as important things. But yeah, knowing the ins and outs of the press too, it's knowing the limit of what can I do to this press so that I don't break it, but so that it gets the result I want, like taking out the crescent for the worm gear, or using the rollers in a weird way, or using the brayers and adjusting things. I think though I am wired just to understand, I have to know how things work. I've never had the ability to just kind of take something at its face value. Why is this thing not working correctly? It's not, oh, it's broken. It's, well, what's broken about it? And if we fix it, what does it take to fix it? And is that a weak point, or kind of things like that? But yeah, I would say that's probably a big reason of why building with type is, because it's a thing. I know what it is, and when it goes together with this other thing, it makes something. It's not just a stroke, which is totally fine too, which is not my cup of tea.
Well, I would say lucky us, as somebody who's had you repair equipment.
Yes, you've helped get some presses around here up and going, which we appreciate. Spent lots of time oily here at Hamilton, so we appreciate it.
Well, it's always fun getting oily up there.
Right? Somebody else's presses you get to play with. That's never a bad thing. I will say we've come up on our hour. Cory, this was amazing. Thank you so much. You shared so much and we all really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.